Veyra looked at him. The rain came down around them, soft and steady. The valley was going dark below. Neither of them moved. The distance between them was not very large. It got smaller. Veyra was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the rain was coming down around them and neither of them said anything. Theo's hand moved slightly toward hers on the ground between them. Veyra did not move away. She looked at his face and he looked at hers, and the distance got smaller still, and "Achoo!" Solon sneezed from directly behind them. Theo and Veyra separated. Both of them looked forward at the valley. Neither of them looked at each other. The rain continued falling. The sound of Mirren's hand connecting with the back of Solon's head was very loud in the quiet clearing. "You absolute idiot," Mirren said, barely above a whisper, her voice tight with fury. Veyra stood up. Her ears were red. She smoothed the front of her shirt with both hands, then stopped, then reached into the inside of her folded armor and took out a necklace, a fine silver chain with a small pendant, a family sigil worked in dark metal, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. "Turn around," Veyra said, her voice doing its best to sound composed and not entirely succeeding. Theo turned around, his own neck warm. Veyra leaned down and settled the chain around his neck, her fingers working the clasp at the back. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not. "You can turn back," she said. Theo turned around. He looked down at the pendant resting against his chest, then up at her. "What is this?" he asked, his eyes bright. Veyra clasped her hands behind her back and lifted her chin. "That is the sigil of my family," she said in her most formal voice. "By accepting it, you are now under the protection of the Veyra household. As my subject and a valued member of this village, it is only right that you carry the mark of your guardian." She paused. "It is also a thank you for the coat," Veyra said. Theo looked at the pendant. He looked at her. He smiled, wide and genuine, the kind that took over his whole face. "Thank you," he said. Veyra looked away, her cheeks warm. "I would also like a pendant," Solon said from behind them. "I have served you for 260 years, Solon added. "Hush," said Veyra. Theo looked down at the pendant again. He picked it up carefully between two fingers, looked at the sigil, and let it rest back against his chest. Veyra saw him do it. She turned back to her armor and did not let him see the largest smile she had worn in a very long time. It was an early evening when Veyra heard the commotion. Theo burst out of the tree line at a full sprint, grinning, his pack bouncing hard on his back. Behind him, the forest erupted, birds lifting from branches, small creatures pouring between the roots, two young deer at a full sprint, something larger crashing through the undergrowth behind them. Veyra stood up. Mirren and Solon were already on their feet, hands moving toward weapons. Theo skidded to a stop in front of the pale root, breathing hard, still grinning. "Good evening, Veyra," Theo said, as though arriving with half the forest behind him was entirely normal. "Don't mind the crowd." He swung his pack off his shoulder, set it down, and reached inside. He pulled out a fruit and set it on the flat of the pale root. Then another. Then a third. They were large, heavier than they looked. The skin was deep warm gold, smoother than anything from the valley market, and the smell came off them immediately, rich, sweet, the smell that had been coming off Theo's cloth bag every evening for 4 months, except now it filled the entire boundary clearing all at once. Veyra went still. Mirren stepped forward out of the tree line, then kept walking until she was standing beside Veyra. Solon followed, moving up behind them both. All three of them stood looking at the 3 fruits on the pale root in the early evening light. Nobody spoke. Theo was already pulling out his cutting board. "Usually I only find 1, he said, setting it flat beside the fruits, but today there were 3. He picked up the first one and sliced into it cleanly. The inside was deep amber. The smell doubled. Herdnest, Veyra had seen this fruit once in her life before Theo. At her coming-of-age ceremony 3 centuries ago, she had been given a single piece no larger than her thumbnail on a ceremonial cloth. She had held it for a long time before eating it. She had seen it in ancient texts. She had seen a preserved specimen behind glass in a family archive. She had been told it was the rarest fruit in the known world, that even ancients, in all their centuries, might find one in an entire lifetime, and even then it was expected to be contributed to the ruling bloodline for ceremony. Some ceremonies used painted fakes because the real ones were so scarce. Theo cut it into neat pieces the way he always did. The way he always did. Theo glanced up at her before she looked down. Her eyes were bright, too bright, the way eyes get right before someone decides not to cry. Veyra looked at the pieces on the cutting board. She thought about every evening for the past 4 months. Every cloth unfolded on this route. Every piece she had taken without thinking. She tried to count. She stopped counting. The number was too large and the pieces had been so small, and she had eaten every single one without once asking what they were, because they were just the fruit Theo brought, casually and without ceremony, the way other people brought conversation. "Theo," Veyra called out, keeping her voice level. "Yeah?" He was already moving to the second fruit. "How long have you been finding these?" she asked, trying to keep the question casual. "Oh, a couple years," he said. "Once you know where to look, they turn up pretty often." He pushed a generous pile of pieces toward her. Then he looked up at Mirhan and Solon. His face opened into that smile. "We have extra today," he said, and picked up a whole fruit and tossed it to Solon. Solon caught it with both hands. He looked down at it. He looked at the gold skin, the weight of it, the smell coming off it. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, then the other. He held the fruit in both hands, and his lips moved quietly. Theo watched this, then looked at Mirhan. "Is he all right?" Theo asked, genuinely uncertain. "He is praying," Mirhan said. She reached out and picked up a piece from the cutting board. She looked at it for a moment. She put it in her mouth. Her eyes closed. She chewed slowly. She swallowed. She opened her eyes and looked at the small creatures that had crept up to the edge of the root, noses working. "Shoo," Mirhan said, waving them back firmly. "Go on." Theo looked at the cut pieces, picked one up, and sniffed it. "Is there something wrong with them today?" Theo asked, looking over the apple piece. "No," Veyra said. "Absolutely not." She picked up several pieces and put them all in her mouth at once. Theo looked satisfied. He broke off 2 pieces and held them down to the creature at his boot. Mirhan reached over and took another piece from Veyra's pile. Then another. She was still shooing animals with one hand. They walked home in the last of the evening light, the forest quiet around them. Veyra carried a cloth folded over a pile of remaining slices. Mirhan walked beside her. Solon walked behind them both, his orin cradled against his chest in both hands, lips still moving. Mirhan reached over and pulled a slice from Veyra's cloth. The moment it hit her tongue, her eyes went somewhere else entirely, her jaw slowing, a small exhale through her nose. "I cannot believe I am eating orin," Mirhan said, her mouth full. Veyra pulled a slice from the cloth herself and put it in her mouth. She chewed. The fruit dissolved warm and sweet, and she briefly forgot what she was about to say. "I cannot believe I have been eating orin for the last 4 months," Veyra said, her voice somewhere between wonder and disbelief. "Theo is blessed," Solon said quietly from behind them. "Indeed he is," Mirhan said. Her hand moved to the cloth again. Veyra pulled it slightly out of reach on instinct, then felt guilty and let her have it. "Only the blessed can find orin," Mirhan added, pulling out another piece. "That is just folklore," Veyra said, taking another slice herself. "No one in recorded history has ever been blessed." Mirhan chewed thoughtfully. Swallowed. "Our new report will be in the history books then," she said, reaching for another slice, "first ever recorded as blessed by the forest." She paused mid-chew. "And it is a human," Mirhan said. "Who happens to be one of my subjects," Veyra added. Mirhan stopped walking for half a step. "That is not the point," Mirhan said, unable to keep the exasperation out of her voice. "Make sure to note it in the report," said Veyra, mouth full. Mirhan pulled 2 slices from the cloth at once and ate them both. She stared straight ahead at the path and kept chewing and said nothing. She reached for another slice. "Your brother is going to freak out," Mirhan said, reaching into the cloth and pulling out another piece. "Our entire race is going to freak out," Veyra said, and reached into the cloth for another slice, her fingers finding nothing but the empty weave of the fabric. She looked down at the cloth, then at Mirhan. Mirhan was already chewing, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her expression settled into a mask of perfect composure. Veyra's eyes narrowed. "Mirren!" Veyra shouted as Mirren's pace increased. Behind them, Solon held his Orin against his chest with both hands, his eyes wide and bright, completely in awe. The evenings had grown cooler. Theo and Veyra sat together at the pale root, their backs against the bark, legs stretched out side by side, a cloth of Orin slices between them and 2 cups of tea that Theo had carried up from the village in a wrapped pot. Theo picked up a slice and held it up in the last of the light. "Orin," he said, turning the fruit slowly, "that is really what it is called?" Veyra watched him, unable to keep the amusement out of her voice. "That is the name." He nodded slowly, turning the slice over. Then he ate it and chewed thoughtfully, before letting out a small, "Huh." Her amusement sharpened into suspicion. "What?" "Nothing," Theo answered, entirely at peace with this. "It tastes the same." "You found out today that you have been casually sharing the most sacred fruit in the ancient world for 4 months, Veyra torn between horror and laughter, and it tastes the same to you." "It is very good fruit," Theo replied, his tone growing serious. Veyra picked up her tea. They sat in comfortable silence. The valley below settled into evening, the first lights coming on in the village. The forest behind them was still. Too still. Theo had been looking at the tree line on and off for the last hour. Now he set his cup down. "The forest has been quiet lately," he said. Veyra's voice lost its lightness as she looked toward the trees. "I noticed. 3 days ago I found a line of broken trees past the second ridge, something large, moving fast." He paused, his gaze fixed on the northeast. "I have not seen anything like it before," Theo added. Veyra said nothing. Theo turned away from the tree line to look directly at her. "I want you to be careful," Theo told her, his easy tone gone from his voice. He was not looking at the tree line anymore. He was looking at her, direct and unhurried, the way he always looked at her. Veyra straightened against the bark, the protector returning to her voice. "I have been defending your village for 260 years, Veyra said. "I have not yet lost a single villager." "I know," Theo whispered, his eyes soft, "but I am not worried about the village." Veyra held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached over, picked up an orange slice and put it in his mouth. Theo went very still. He chewed. He swallowed. He looked straight ahead at the valley with his jaw set and said nothing, but the tips of his ears had gone red in the evening light, and Veyra saw it and looked back at the valley too. "I will be careful," Veyra whispered back, the tips of her ears going pink. She reached over and put an orange slice in Theo's mouth before he could say anything else. The day it happened arrived like any other evening. Theo came along the eastern path and found the pale root empty. He set his bag down, pulled out the fruit he had found that day, and waited. The valley below went dark. The village fires came on one by one. The forest was silent. Then from somewhere deep in the trees came the sound of steel striking bone. Theo stood up. Veyra had told him to stay back when the fights came. He knew this. He had agreed to this. He looked at the empty root. He looked at the tree line. The air was heavy and the birds had stopped and nothing in the forest was moving. "This doesn't feel right," Theo said, already picking up his bag. He ran toward the sound. Theo heard the fight before he saw it. Steel on bone. A sound like a tree coming down. Then silence, which was worse. He ran. The clearing opened without warning, and he took in all of it at once. Solon was on the ground, his armor caved in on one side, not moving. Mirren was on the ground 10 feet from him, one arm bent wrong, eyes closed. Veyra was standing. Barely. Her armor was broken across the chest, the pieces hanging loose, and a wound ran from her collarbone up to her jaw, deep and dark, the skin around it already swollen and wrong. She had her sword up, but her arm was shaking and her feet were not steady. The bear was enormous. Bigger than anything Theo had seen in 2 years of deep forest work. Ancient, heavy, scarred across her entire body from the fight, one eye sealed shut and bleeding. She was rising to her full height, both arms coming up, claws spread, her one good eye fixed on Veyra. Theo ran between them. "Theo," Veyra's voice cracked, "stay back." Theo planted his feet between Veyra and the bear and spread both arms wide and screamed. The bear swung. Theo jumped back. He could not go far. Veyra was directly behind him and could not move. The claws caught him across the chest and tore it open in 4 lines from his left shoulder to his right side. He staggered. He did not go down. He spread his arms again and screamed louder. "Theo, run," Veyra's voice broke. "Please." The bear rose up on both legs. Both arms came up. Veyra closed her eyes. The blow did not come. Instead, sound, low and urgent, from the tree line on 3 sides at once. Veyra opened her eyes. 3 bears stepped into the clearing. Each one had grown to roughly Theo's height since he had last seen them, their dark brown fur thicker now, their shoulders broad, their faces still carrying something of the newborns he had pulled from the hollow between 2 fallen trunks on a cold morning months ago. The 3 cubs moved directly to Theo and pressed themselves around him, between him and their mother, making sounds low in their chests. They pushed their heads against his hands. They turned their faces toward their mother and kept making those sounds, urgent and continuous, pleading. The enraged bear's one good eye moved between her cubs and Theo. Her raised arms lowered slowly. Theo looked at the 3 of them surrounding him. He looked at their size, their coloring, the shape of their faces. His own arms came down. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey, I know you, it's all right." The cubs pressed closer to their mother, still talking to her in that low, continuous sound. The enraged bear looked at Theo for a long moment. Then the tension went out of her body all at once, and what was left was a badly wounded animal, exhausted and in pain, surrounded by her children. She dropped to all 4s. Her cubs moved with her as she turned, and the 4 of them walked back into the tree line and were gone. Theo turned around. Veyra was looking at him, her sword arm dropped, her amber eyes wide and bright. Then her knees buckled. Theo crossed the clearing in 4 steps and caught her before she hit the ground. He lowered her slowly, one arm behind her back, and looked at her face. Her eyes were open but unfocused, going in and out. "I have you," Theo said, his voice low and steady. "Stay with me." Her eyes found his face for a moment. Then they closed. Theo knelt over her and looked at the wound running from her collarbone to her jaw. Beside it, running the same path, the old scar was dark, darker than he had ever seen it, almost black at the edges, pulsing faintly with a color that had no business being on living skin. He did not know what it was. He knew it was wrong. He pressed clean cloth against the fresh wound with one hand and reached into the bottom of his pack with the other and pulled out a small clay jar. He opened it, pressed 2 fingers into the salve inside, and worked it carefully along the full length of the fresh wound first, then along the old scar, covering all of it, pressing firmly. The dark color at the edges of the scar faded. Slowly, then faster. The pulsing stopped. The scar itself, pale and raised for as long as anyone in the ancient city could remember, began, for the first time, to soften. He used half the jar. He moved to Miren. Her eyes opened as he knelt beside her, glassy and unfocused, her head turning toward him slowly. "Veyra," Miren said, her voice barely there. "She is all right," Theo said, already working on the broken arm, the damage across her ribs. "She is right beside you. She is going to be fine." Mirhin's eyes found Veyra across the clearing. She watched her chest rise and fall. Then her eyes closed again. Theo finished with Miren and moved to Solon. He worked the remaining salve into the wound beneath the caved armor, using the last of what was in the jar, pressing until the bleeding stopped. He set the empty jar on the ground beside him. He sat back on his heels and looked at the 3 of them. Then he stood up. His legs felt heavier than usual. He noticed this and kept moving. He built the fire first, then cut branches for a low shelter, working steadily in the dark. He laid all 3 of them under it on his coat and his pack cloth, positioning them close to the fire's warmth. He gave them water through the night, one at a time, lifting their heads carefully, making sure they swallowed. He talked to them quietly each time. "You are all right, I am here," Theo said. At some point, he tore strips from the spare cloth in his pack and wrapped his chest with both hands, pulling the bandaging tight. The bleeding slowed. It did not stop. He tied it off, sat beside the fire, and kept watch. Some time before dawn, Veyra opened her eyes. The fire was low. The shelter was quiet. Somewhere nearby, an owl called once and went silent. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she felt it, a hand wrapped around hers, warm and rough at the knuckles. Theo was sitting beside her, his back against the shelter post, his head tipped forward with exhaustion. But his eyes were open. When she stirred, he looked at her, and he smiled, small and tired and completely himself. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper so as not to wake the others. Veyra looked at him. At the bandaging on his chest, dark in the firelight. At the lines of exhaustion in his face. At his hand around hers. "I told you to stay back," she said, her voice coming out soft. She had meant it to come out stern. "I know," Theo said. "You are an idiot," she whispered. "I know," he said, and moved closer. She reached up and pulled him down to her. She kissed him. He kissed her back. The fire crackled beside them and the forest was quiet, and she was warm, and she was alive, and he was here, and that was everything. When she pulled back, she looked at his face for a moment. His eyes were soft and tired and happy. She lay back down. His hand found hers again in the dark. She fell back asleep with his hand still in hers. Dawn came gray and cold into the clearing. Veyra opened her eyes and did not know where she was. She was on the ground. There was a fire, burned low. A shelter of cut branches above her. Her chest ached and her head was heavy, and she lay still for a moment trying to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. The bear. The clearing. Theo running between them. She sat up too fast and her vision went white at the edges. She waited. It cleared. Mirhen was already sitting up across the fire, pressing her hands slowly along her ribs, bending her arm, her face tight with concentration. She looked at Solon beside her. She looked at Veyra. Something in her expression shifted, the look of someone who has just seen something they had stopped believing they would ever see. "Your jaw," Mirhen said. Veyra touched her collarbone. Ran her fingers upward along her jaw. Smooth. Closed. Warm. She went completely still. 300 years. She pressed 2 fingers against the line where the scar had always been and felt only her own skin, unmarked, as though it had never been there at all. Mirhen had gone absolutely still across the fire. She had looked at that scar every day for 260 years. She had no words for what its absence meant. Neither of them spoke. Veyra pressed her hands carefully along her ribs. Clean cloth wrapped tight, she could feel the bandaging beneath her shirt. Her shoulder, where the armor had torn through, she pressed there too. Nothing. Healed. She sat with all of it for a moment. The scar. The wounds. The fire that had been built and kept through the night. The hand holding hers in the dark. Her eyes went to Theo across the clearing. Chin dropped to his chest. She had not dreamed it. She looked at Mirhen. Mirhen looked back at her. Both of them looked at Solon, who was sitting up slowly, running his hands along the caved section of his armor with an expression of profound confusion. "How?" Solon said. Nobody answered because nobody knew. Theo was sitting against a tree at the clearing's edge, his chin dropped to his chest, his hands open in his lap. Bandaging wrapped his chest in uneven layers, dark and wet all the way through. Beneath him the ground was dark, still spreading slowly outward. Veyra crossed the clearing and crouched beside him. She pressed her hand to his chest. He was breathing, shallow and slow, each breath smaller than the last. She looked at the empty clay jar on the ground beside him. She looked at the bandaging on his chest, the strips of spare cloth tied off with his own hands in the dark. He had used every last drop on the 3 of them. He had wrapped his own wound and sat beside the fire all night and said nothing. Veyra held his face in both hands. Her hands were shaking. She had held them steady through the fight, through the night, through the dawn, but they were shaking now. Tears ran down her face as she pressed her palm flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat beneath her hand, faint and slow and still there. "I have been defending your village for 260 years, Veyra said, forcing her voice steady. "I have not yet lost a single villager. And I will not lose you, Veyra cried out. She stood up straight. Solon, she called out. Solon was already on his feet. He crossed the clearing and lifted Theo from the ground carefully, turning him and taking his full weight across both arms. Veyra looked at Mirren. Run ahead, Veyra said, already turning to follow Solon. Bring every healer to our home. Mirren ran. Veyra and Solon followed, and the forest blurred past them on both sides, and Theo's breathing stayed shallow and slow against Solon's chest the whole way. A few days after the battle, Vaughn's chamber had not been slept in. The candles had burned to stubs. The reports covered the table in overlapping stacks, margins filled with notes, some pages read so many times the paper had gone soft at the edges. 3 cold cups. A pot nobody had refilled in 2 hours. The window behind Vaughn showed the city waking up in the gray morning light, and in the street below Veyra's residence, another delegation was arranging itself. Vaughn stood at the window. He was the tallest of them, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a face that had learned over centuries to give nothing away. He was the eldest of the ruling bloodline. His word was the city's law. Kalis sat at the corner of the table nearest the window. Sharp-featured, dark-eyed, close-cropped black hair shot through with silver at the temples. She had not leaned back in her chair once since the meeting began. She had written half the political agreements currently holding the city's alliances together, which meant she also knew exactly how fast they could come apart. Rovan sat across from her with his elbows on the table. Younger than the rest, which showed in the looseness of his expression when he was tired, and he was tired. He had the reports in front of him and had stopped looking at them an hour ago because there was nothing in them he had not already memorized. Devon sat at the far end with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He administered the Eastern Territories. He had been awake the longest. It showed. Sarah sat beside him with the Elder Healer's analysis open on the table. She had placed it there 2 hours ago. She had not touched it since. Below the window, a 4th Sorvith delegation joined the others outside Veyra's residence. 4, Rovan said. I see it, Vaughn said, without turning from the window. They have been sending one every hour since sunrise, Saley said, unable to keep the contempt out of her voice. Get-well gifts, very considerate of them. The Sorvith house does not send get-well gifts, Davon said. They are planting a flag. And every house in this city is watching them do it, Kaylee said, letting that land before she continued, and watching us do nothing. We are not doing nothing, Rovan said, his voice tight. We are trying to determine what we are actually dealing with before we act. We know what we are dealing with, Devon said, cutting him off. He reached across and tapped the healer's report. A human, forest blessed, 40 to 50 oran fruits in a single salve preparation. Our entire ceremonial supply for the year does not reach that number. He produces them on his morning walks, Davon said. He has been sharing them with Veyra for 4 months, Sarah said, sliding the healer's cross-reference across the table. The estimate puts her consumption at over 200 pieces during this period. 200, Rovan said. Not to inform anyone. Just to say it out loud again. Our whole family combined has not consumed that quantity in 50 years, Seeley said, letting the number sit. He is one human, Devon said, unable to keep the disbelief out of his voice, walking into the forest every morning and coming back with Orin like he is picking up stones. And now every faction in this city knows it, Kaylee said, moving on. The healer's report has been in circulation since dawn. The Sorvith house has read it. The Vethara house has read it. Everyone has read it and everyone is doing the same calculation right now. What calculation? Rovan said, raising his voice, genuinely not seeing it yet. Whether it is worth it, Kaylee said, her voice dropping, to take the human in, to bring him into the house. The room went quiet. But he is human, Davin said flatly. Yes, Kaylee said, that is exactly the part they are calculating. No house is going to bring a human into their bloodline, Devon said, trying to hold the certainty in his voice. That is not how this works. That has never been how this works. The Sorvith house has sent 4 delegations to our sister's residence before breakfast, Sayla said, an edge in her voice now. Tell me again what the Sorvith house is not going to do. Davon said nothing. And the Vethara house, Rovan said quietly. Kalis looked at him. The Vethara house, Rovan said again, quieter. They have more unmarried daughters than any house in the city. You know how they move when they see an opportunity? You know how fast they move. Nobody disagreed with this. He is still human, Davan said, his voice losing ground. Even if a lesser house made the attempt, the political cost would be considerable. The political cost of Orin access in these quantities, Kaylee said, sharp. Davan, think about what you are saying. I am saying there is no precedent for this, Davan said, switching ground. There is no protocol. We would be placing a human inside the ruling bloodline. What does that mean? What does he become? What are his rights? What are our obligations to him? No law governs this. Neither does the Sorbeth house, Kalis said. Neither does Veyra, and they are moving anyway. Because they are not the ruling bloodline, Davan said, his last argument, and he knew it. Veyra is a princess of this house. There are standards that govern who she can be placed with. Those standards exist for reasons that do not disappear because the situation is inconvenient. Veyra, Rovan said carefully, has had the cursed scar removed from her face by a human who spent the night alone with her in the deep forest. The room went very still. The scar is gone, Rovan continued, making sure every person at the table heard it. For 300 years we could not place her in any arrangement because no house would take her with the scar. Now the scar is gone, but every faction in this city knows the circumstances under which it was removed. He looked around the table. Which house is going to accept her in a formal arrangement now? Which house is going to look at what happened in that forest and proceed as though it did not happen? Rovan asked. Nobody answered. No house will accept her, Rovan said, his voice flat with the weight of it. Not now. No house will accept her, Kalis said, picking it up from Rovan without pause. But every house in this city already knows we have left Veyra at that boundary for 260 years. They know we posted her there because of the scar. They know we stopped trying. She looked around the table. They will not hesitate to use that against us. If we do not move, they will go to the human directly, and if the reports are accurate about what passed between him and Veyra in that forest, they will come for her as well, Salis said. Nobody looked at anyone. He is human, Davan said, but his voice had changed. The certainty had gone out of it. Yes, Kaylee said, turning to face Vaughn's back directly. He is, and he is the only option that does not leave Veyra unplaced while 6 other factions compete for the Orin supply she introduced into this city. She paused. We offer Veyra to the human. We bring him into the family ranks. We secure the Orin access, and we close the question of Veyra's placement in the same arrangement. Every house in this city will understand what we have done, Kaylee said. Vaughn had not spoken in 20 minutes. He was still at the window. Below, a 5th delegation, Veyra colors, appeared at the far end of the avenue. He turned around. Call the assembly, Vaughn said. Bring Veyra, bring the human. The assembly hall was older than the city built around it. The ceiling was high, and the light came in sideways through narrow windows, falling in long pale strips across the stone floor. Every titled member of the ruling bloodline sat along the walls. The council sat behind them. Theo walked in beside Veyra. His chest was bandaged under his shirt. He looked at the length of the room, at the faces, at the people seated along the walls. Veyra moved to the back corner. Mirhen took her place on Veyra's left. Solon took her right. Veyra stood straight, her hands at her sides, her eyes forward, not at Vaughn, not at the council, not at anyone. The woman who had laughed on the ground with wolf cubs and shouted at Solon about a pendant was not in this room. In this room, she was completely still and completely closed, and Theo did not know these people, but he understood immediately that she had been standing in this corner for a very long time. Theo looked back at her. She met his eyes. He faced forward. An attendant guided Theo to the center of the hall. He stood there alone, the full length of the room between him and Veyra. Vaughn sat at the front. He looked at Theo. You are the human from the Boundary Village, Vaughn said, studying him. Yes, Theo answered, his voice easy. My name is Theo. Vaughn nodded. He named the Orin quantities in the healer's report. He named what Forest Blessing meant under the laws of the ancient city. He named the houses currently moving on the situation and what each of them intended. On behalf of the ruling bloodline, Rovan said, rising formally from his seat, we make the following offer. You will be granted formal rank within our family structure. You will have full access to this city and its protections. Your Orin access will fall under the authority of this house. He paused. In exchange, we offer you Veyra of the ruling bloodline in formal arrangement, Rovan said. The hall broke into noise. Members turned to their neighbors. Voices rose in low, urgent exchanges across every row. This was not information that had left Vaughn's chamber, and the assembly was hearing it for the first time. Theo looked at Vaughn. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the council seated along the walls. Then he turned and looked at Veyra standing in the back corner with Mirren on her left and Solon on her right. Theo called out across the full length of the hall, "What do you want to do, Veyra?" Rowan immediately interjected, "The terms are clear and the offer is fair. The human need only confirm his acceptance." "I heard the terms," Theo replied, his focus never leaving the back corner. "I am asking Veyra." Veyra's hands tightened at her sides. No one had ever asked her that in this room. "Human, what Veyra wants is not the point of this family arrangement." Rowan's voice rose in frustration. "This decision belongs to the head of this family." "The arrangement is about her life," Theo continued, ignoring the council. "What she wants is the only thing relevant to this discussion." Theo walked back through the hall. All eyes followed him. Past the council. Past the seated assembly. The full length of the room, straight to the back corner. He stopped in front of Veyra and went down on one knee. Mirren went rigid. Solon's hand moved to his side. Theo looked up at Veyra. "I don't understand most of what they said," Theo said, "but I understand they are deciding what happens to you without asking you." He held her gaze. "You have been protecting our village for 260 years. You protected me in that forest. I think you should get to decide something for yourself," he said. He paused. "What do you want, Veyra?" Theo said. Veyra looked down at him. She looked at his bandaged chest. She looked at his face. "Human, what Veyra wants is not the point of this family arrangement." Rowan's voice came across the hall. Veyra looked up at Rowan. "His name is Theo," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. She looked back down at Theo. He was still on one knee. He had walked the full length of this hall and knelt on the stone floor, and the only thing he had asked about was what she wanted. Nobody in this room had ever asked her that. Not once. In 260 years. Her throat was tight. Her eyes were bright. She looked at the center of the room, at the open stone floor she had never once crossed toward in all the years she had stood in this corner. She stepped forward. Mirren's breath caught. Solon straightened. Theo rose to his feet. Veyra walked to the center of the hall and stopped. She raised one hand and placed it over her heart. She looked at Theo across the room. She spoke in the old tongue. 8 words. A sharp breath came from near the back wall. Then a name, the name of the ritual, spoken barely above a whisper. The person beside them repeated it. It moved through the seated rows, that one word passing from mouth to mouth until it had reached every corner of the hall. Members of the assembly turned to each other and spoke in low, urgent voices. 2 council leaders rose from their seats. Rowan's hands gripped the edge of his seat. Vaughn sat without moving. Veyra lowered her hand from her heart. She turned to face the assembly. "Theo is blessed by the forest," she said. "I have witnessed it. His access to Aran is not a resource this house or any house can place under its authority. It belongs to the forest. It belongs to him. That clause does not stand." She looked at Vaughn. Vaughn looked back at her. Rowan rose from his seat. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he said. "We had terms. The arrangement was clear." Vaughn stood up. Every voice in the hall stopped. Every head turned. "The arrangement is closed," Vaughn said. The assembly rose together. Vaughn walked. Past the council. Past the table. Down the length of the hall. "But brother," Rowan called out to him from the back of the hall. Vaughn stopped. He stood in front of Veyra. He looked at her, at the center of the hall, where she had never stood before, where she was standing now. Something moved through his face. It was brief. It was gone before anyone realized it. "Veyra has spoken," he announced sternly for everyone to hear. Then he walked out. The council leaders rose and followed him. The assembly filed out behind them. Veyra stood at the center of the hall. She had just claimed Theo in front of her entire family. For the first time in centuries, her decision had been heard and upheld. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She pressed both hands against her face. Her cheeks burned under her palms. Theo stood in the back corner between Mihen and Solon. "What just happened?" Theo asked, the words out before he had fully processed what he was asking. Mihen looked at him. Tears ran down her face. "She claimed you," Miren said. "What does that mean?" Theo asked, unable to look away from her. "It means you are hers," Miren said, "and she is now yours." Solon drew himself to his full height. He looked at Theo with great seriousness. "And now I too am yours," Solon said. Miren reached up and slapped the back of his head. She turned her face away, jaw tight, the laugh pressing up behind her teeth. "Not now," she said, wiping her tears and smiling. Theo looked across the hall at Veyra. Veyra looked at Theo and smiled. Some weeks later, Miren was standing outside the door with her arms folded when it opened. Theo came out first, pack over one shoulder, hair still damp. Veyra stepped out behind him and took his arm without looking, the way she always took it, both hands drawn close. "You're 4 minutes late," Miren's tone scolding. Veyra dismissed her casually while walking past. "We know." Miren unfolded her arms, shaking her head, and fell into step behind them. Solon fell in beside her, already looking at the path ahead. The ancient city was quiet around them, the stone paths still cool in the early light. "We are sleeping at Theo's house tonight," Veyra said, as though this had already been decided and any objections were purely administrative. Miren let out a frustrated groan. "His house fits 2 people. "You will manage," Veyra insisted, pulling Theo closer to her. Miren let out a frustrated groan. She scratched her head, looking at the group of 4. "You know there are 4 of us and only 1 bed?" Theo turned his head, his eyes smiling and apologetic. "Sorry, Miren, we won't have the necessary materials for the new home until the traveling merchant arrives next week," Theo said. Solon turned his head toward Miren with a shrug. "I heard the porch is lovely this time of the year." Miren huffed, shrugged, and kept walking. Veyra pulled Theo closer and whispered something. Theo chuckled. The forest opened up around them, and they walked in. Another morning. Another day in the forest. A few weeks passed. Theo found himself at the ancient healer's hall, which was on the far side of the city. Theo cut through the main avenue, dropped off the samples, and turned back toward the tree line. He made it halfway. "Theo." She stepped out from the colonnade to his left. Gold and silver, the colors of House Sorveth. Her hair was pinned high, 2 gold clasps catching the morning light. She held out a small lacquered box with both hands. A navigational instrument, calibrated for the deep forest's magnetic variations. "I had it made for you," she said. Theo opened the box. The instrument inside was exquisite. "This is remarkable. How did you calibrate for the third ridge interference?" Theo asked. She smiled and stepped closer. "I consulted the ancient surveys, quite involved. We can arrange your visit to our archives to see them in person," she said. "Theo!" called another voice from his right. Theo turned. She came from his right in deep violet, a gown cut low across the chest, the fabric fitted clothes all the way down and pooling at the floor. Her dark hair was loose. Her perfume hit him before she was close enough to speak. He carried a cloth bundle in both hands and held it out with a slow smile. "A root cutting from the eastern grove," she said. "I thought of you when I found it." The Sorveth woman's chin lifted by a degree. The Vethera woman took one small, precise step forward. Theo looked between them. He looked at the lacquered box in one hand and the root cutting in the other. He opened the cloth and examined the cutting with genuine interest. "I haven't seen this variety past the second ridge before." The Vethera woman leaned into him with a slow smile. "I know. I have been paying very close attention to your work." The Sorveth woman stepped between them and turned Theo gently by the shoulder to face her. "As I was saying, Theo, would you like to join me in our archives?" A third woman came around the corner with a wrapped parcel, her eyes locked on Theo. A fourth appeared behind her. A fifth came through the arch ahead, moving fast. The Sorveth woman pressed closer on his left. The Vethera woman pressed closer on his right. Someone's hand found his arm and pulled. Someone else took his other arm. The perfume was coming from 3 directions. "He already agreed to visit our archives," the Sorveth woman said. "He said nothing of the sort," the Vethera woman shot back. "I heard him clearly." "You heard what you wished to hear." Theo was pulled left, then right. He planted his feet and looked across the tops of their heads toward the edge of the avenue. Mirhen stood there, satchel over one shoulder, watching the whole thing with her hand pressed over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She caught his eye. She gave him both thumbs up. Theo stared at her. Mirhen pressed her lips together, looked away, and looked back. Her shoulders shook harder. The arguing got louder. The circle got tighter. Then Theo felt a familiar grip on his arm. Veyra pulled him out of the crowd in one hard motion, tucking him against her side. Her cold amber eyes scanned the assembled women. The women of houses Sorvith and Bethara went still. They straightened. They bowed, deep, formal. They made their apologies and left. Veyra tugged Theo toward her. Her cheeks were full. Her eyes were narrow. "I told you to wait for me at the tree line," Veyra said, trying to keep the possessiveness out of her voice and not entirely succeeding. Theo allowed himself to be led away. I had the healer delivery. Her eyes stayed forward, her grip tightening slightly. "The tree line, Theo." He fell into step beside her, wisely not elaborating. It was a quick errand. Her eyes narrowed further. She looked at the lacquered box in his hand. She looked at the root cutting in his other hand. She looked back at his face. She turned and walked, his arm held against her chest. Theo fell into step beside her. Mirhen and Solen followed behind them. Veyra's chin came up. "I am filing a formal complaint to both houses. In writing," Veyra said. "The House Assembly will not approve," Solen noted from behind them. "I have spoken," Veyra yelled, flustered. Theo reached into his pack. He pulled out a piece of Auran and held it out to her. Veyra kept her chin up. Her eyes stayed forward. She did not take it. The fruit stayed in his hand. 3 steps. 5. Her eyes cut sideways to it. She looked away. 2 more steps. She eventually took it and chewed. The line of her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her cheeks, still faintly full, softened. Mirhen watched this from behind. "I wish I had something to calm her down," Mirhen said, with the tone of someone who has said this many times before. Solen reached into his pack. He held a piece of Auran out to Mirhen without looking at her. Mirhen took it. She slapped the back of his head. They all kept walking, the stone path ahead leading them back through the quiet city toward home. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of Part 2. If Theo and Veyra made you feel something, a like and a subscribe means more than you know. It helps this story reach people who would love it just as much as you did. And drop a comment. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me which scene got you. I read every single one. I will see you in the next one. A few days had passed since Veyra claimed Theo at the assembly hall. The ancient city had settled back into its routines. In Veyra's residence at the edge of the city, closest to the tree line, the night was quiet. Veyra slept. Theo was not sure what woke him. Not a sound exactly. More, the specific quality of silence that meant the silence was being maintained deliberately. He had spent enough years in the deep forest to know the difference. He got up. The living quarters were dark. He stepped through the doorway and stopped. Mirhen and Solen were in the corner. Bound at the wrists, ankles, gagged, blindfolded, seated back to back. Around the room, at every window and doorway, stood soldiers in armor Theo did not recognize. Dark colors. No insignia he could read. Completely still. Vaughn sat at the table. He looked exactly as he had in the assembly hall, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the face that gave nothing away. Theo looked at Mirhen and Solen in the corner. He looked at the soldiers at the windows. He looked at Vaughn. "Would you like some tea?" Theo asked. Vaughn looked at him for a long moment. 2 sugars, Vaughn said. Theo put the water on. They waited in silence while the water heated. The soldiers did not move. Mirhen and Solen did not move. The fire burned low in the hearth. Theo set a cup in front of Vaughn and sat down across from him. Vaughn wrapped both hands around it and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Theo. Vaughn studied him for a long moment. "I came to thank you, Theo," Vaughn said. for your actions at the assembly hall to protect Veyra's interest. Thank you." "You're welcome," Theo replied. Then something changed. Not gradually. All at once. Vaughn set his cup down. He stood up. He was very tall. Standing, he filled the space between the table and the ceiling in a way that had not been apparent when he was sitting. He planted both hands on the table and leaned forward, his weight on his knuckles, his eyes on Theo. The face that had given nothing away in the assembly hall was giving something away now. His jaw was tight, his eyes were burning. This was not Vaughn the ruler. This was a brother. One who had been keeping watch over his sister from a distance in the only way his position had ever allowed him to. "Let me be very clear with you, Theo," Vaughn said, staring down at him from across the table, his voice dropping to something that barely needed volume to fill the room. "If you ever make my sister unhappy," Vaughn said, "I will come for you personally. I will bring the full weight of this bloodline down upon you, and when I am finished with you, I will come for every human settlement within 100 miles, and I will not stop." He paused. "I want to be very clear that I am not speaking rhetorically," Vaughn said, his eyes not leaving Theo's face. Theo looked up at him. He did not lean back. He did not look away. He looked at Vaughn, the white knuckles, the burning eyes, the jaw of a man working very hard to stay in control, and he understood. Not the assembly, not the bloodline, not the soldiers in every doorway. A brother who loved his sister and needed to know she was going to be safe. Theo smiled. Vaughn looked at him for another moment. Then the tension went out of his shoulders. He nodded once, the way you nod when the answer was the correct one. Both drank their tea. Vaughn stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at Theo across the table, the ruling bloodline back in his eyes, the brother tucked away again. "You are now under the protection of this family," he said. "Welcome, Theo." He turned toward the door. His soldiers moved with him. At the doorway, he stopped. He looked at Mirren and Solon in the corner, still bound, still blindfolded, still gagged, still sitting back to back on the floor where his soldiers had left them. "Next time you two put my sister in danger," Vaughn said, "it will not end with just a rope." He paused. "And don't think I don't know about the orans you two been snacking for the last few weeks," Vaughn added, his voice dropping further. Herd and Solon went very still. Vaughn walked out. His soldiers followed. The door closed behind them. The house went quiet. Mihan and Solon remained in the corner, still bound, still gagged, still blindfolded. Then Solon turned his blindfolded face toward where Theo was sitting. The muffled sound he made was either a question or a comment. It was impossible to tell which. Theo got up and untied them. Then he went back to bed. Veyra was still asleep, her breathing slow and even. He lay down beside her and pulled her close. She stirred slightly and turned toward him without waking, the way she had started to do. He felt the warmth of her against his chest. The forest was quiet outside. The city was quiet around them. This was the new ordinary. He closed his eyes.